It's a great pleasure to be able to host our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Petra Gruber. Petra studied architecture and qualified as a professional architect, but also has a strong interest in multidisciplinary design and transdisciplinary design, and has developed that really into a very strong interest also in biomimetics, which is what she's going to talk about tonight. She has, in addition to her professional qualification as an architect, she holds a PhD from the Vienna University of Technology, but she's also collaborated with, as a research fellow at the Center for Biomimetics at the University of Reading. In addition to that, she's taught biomimetics and energy systems at the University of Applied Sciences in Villach in Austria, and has traveled the world basically giving lectures and organizing workshops at various universities. When she was a visiting professor, she set up a new master's program in advanced architectural design at the Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and her research spans projects that are extremely varied but have a unifying theme. So she's done work for the European Space Agency on lunar-based design, which sounds like a pretty good gig to get. And that was looking at informed design using folding principles from nature. And then just to counteract that, she's also developed work in arts-based research on the translation of growth principles from nature into proto-architectural spatial solutions. Since 2016, she has been based at the University of Akron, where she holds a joint appointment between the Myers School of Art and the Department of Biology, and she's mainly located in the Center for Biomimicry Research and Innovation. So please would you join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Gruber for her talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for being here. I was thinking I would give a private lecture maybe, because I was warned it's kind of mid-term and everyone's on holidays. So thanks for coming. And a very warm thank to the organizers who invited me here. So we've been negotiating back and forth to bring me here from the US. And I'm currently already on summer break, so that made things a little easier. So I was actually traveling from Austria, and I'm since 1 week in Europe, so I'm not jet-lagged any longer, and hopefully will not fall asleep during the lecture. And so I'm really happy to be here, also kind of connecting to my history, having been here as a research fellow, meeting up with my old professors and some friends in the UK that I've made over the years. And I would like to talk today about many of my research projects, but also about biomimetics in general and about the methodology that I applied a little bit. So my talk is called Patterns, Growth and Energy, Lessons from Biology for Architectural Design. So we will browse through a range of projects that we did in the past years. And what you see here is my favorite workspace. So that's a place where I feel very much at home. I'm actually a forest person. I have no idea why that is. I feel very comfortable in the jungle. And I was fortunate enough to travel a bit with my biology fellows. So this was in 2009 when I was on a conference visit in French Guiana, and was really fortunate to be guided through the jungle from a biologist who showed me this amazing cathedral tree. So I'm really interested in these overlaps between what biology produces as structures and materials and in general phenomena, and what we in technology can design. So I always had those both interests, and they were always competing inside me. And it was just by chance that I ended up studying architecture, and I was really happy discovering that there is actually this intersection between technology and biology, and I started to do my research with my actually architecture diploma, and I found the works of Frei Otto and the German groups in the 1970s who had a big research funding about biology and building, and I was totally intrigued, and it has not stopped ever since. So that's my kind of background. And so the content of my lecture today is a bit of a generic introduction into biomimetics, and I will use the projects also to show you the methodology that we apply. I will talk mainly about two projects that we got funded from the Austrian Science Fund within the frame of an arts-based research funding. The first one is called Biomimetics, and it was about patterns from nature. The second one was called GRAB, Growing as Building, where we had the chance to dig into growth from biology and how that could inform architectural design. And then I will come to more recent efforts to create new research tracks at the University of Akron, where I'm fortunate enough to have a faculty position and have PhD students who are really great and very interested. So I'll talk a bit about leaf shape thermodynamics and bird's nest structural design, two research threads that we just established. Biomimetics is essentially information transfer from biology to technology. And as you can see here, there's those two distinct sides of nature, biological processes, and then technology with totally different processes in design and also in generating structures and materials. And in between we have the sphere of principles and abstract knowledge. And this is what we try to use to connect those both worlds. So what we're doing is we look to nature, finding and abstracting principles and rules, and applying those abstract rules to a totally different environment, to totally different materials, to totally different conditions. And this is not the only flow of information. By doing this, we also learn a lot. We fail, and we discover that our knowledge is not enough. So what we're in many cases do is we go back to biology and have a closer look how this thing really works, because our first theories might not have been extended enough to fully understand what's going on. So I see biomimetics in the meantime as driving a spiral of knowledge that touches biology and technology in a regular rhythm. So, and I also think that this process of abstraction is the key to the success to whatever we are doing. So it's really important to be aware of in which sphere you're moving along and what exactly you're investigating on and how exactly you name it as well. So language is also really important. And those really takeovers of language from the side of the architects was something that, as a person being educated in biology, really annoyed me. So people were talking about evolutionary design without having any clue about evolution, and they were talking about the genes of architecture without the faintest notion of what that could be. So this confusion in terminology was another trigger for me to dig deeper into this topic. And I decided in my PhD thesis to apply the terminology of biology onto architecture. And this is something that people usually do not do. So all the books about biomimetics or biologically inspired design that I had read so far used the terminology that was based in architectural design or engineering to look at biology. So people looked at shell structures or networks or self-organization, but they never did the other transfer. So I was really interested to look at this interpretation of life, which is the essence of biology, and in my view, and try to apply those criteria onto the built environment and have a look at those categories and what the outcome was. And what you see here is the state of my research of my PhD thesis in 2008. And in those last 10 years, a lot has happened. So some of those white fields that you see in those architectural scales, like urban design, building scale, process scale, material scale, have in the meantime been explored or have started to be explored. So I find that really intriguing, and by that time also there were some fields that I was specifically interested in, and those were growth as a concept, reaction of architecture. So architecture is less static as it was always. So if we don't have electricity, buildings cannot even be opened nowadays. So they are very active, they have a flow of energy and information. And I was also very interested in evolutionary design, like a gradual improvement of architectural design. So we don't really have evolution in architecture in the biological sense, but we have a gradual improvement, and I explored that very much in investigations on traditional architectural typologies, for example in Indonesia, that we chatted about just a few minutes ago. And I find it really amazing in a way that this frame of my research is still valid. So I'm still looking for those signs of life in architecture, and this concept of living architecture might sound very naive, especially to biologists, but it's still something that is the long-term target in a way, to create architecture that is more alive, more adapted, shows more of those really intriguing qualities that we find in biology. And the outcome are not yet products or buildings. We are at the moment, I would not say stuck at the prototype stage, but this is also a field where I feel very comfortable in. I think that the jump from prototype to product is a really complicated field as well, that requires another expertise that I happen to not have. So I'm not a marketing person, I'm not a market analyst. I'm really happy with problems in technology and solving them to a prototype stage. And so what we do is something that you see here. This is an artistic design project that we created within the frame of Biomimetics at the Vienna University of Applied Arts. And it represents different research threads that we followed through the project. We researched structures from nature, especially fiber structures, bundles of fibers. We were interested in local and global shape change of systems, and we were interested in adaptivity and reactivity of systems. And so we created this very simple structure actually that consisted of spiraling tent poles that were interconnected by specifically made metal elements. And then we had those leaf-like structures that could open and close according to the presence of visitors. So it was connected to a computational system, and sensors sensed the presence of visitors, and then the leaves would open and shape change according to the presence. So what you see here is a representation of something that it's not a research project in a sense that it would be the same if other people did the same things with the same materials. So in that sense, it's not a scientific research project. It's what we call science to architecture design by research. So we fed research into a design process. And the outcome is one of many possible outcomes that people could think of. So this is a typical workflow of our project. So we usually start with an interdisciplinary phase where people exchange their knowledge. So we have what we call an input science phase. In this case, we had experts from biology, from nanotechnology, and a big presence from different architectural fields. And we were sure, because this was the project outset, that we wanted to research patterns from nature. And we did this with computational means, but we also did analog, modeling and comparisons. We tried to analyze patterns, and we also tried to simulate them. And then when we have the feeling we know something that is interesting enough to transfer it, the transfer phase starts, and we develop some kind of application and prototype for architecture and for an architectural setting. And we usually work with a very large database of biological role models. So what you see here is, this is too small to read, but it's almost 40 different biological examples that we worked with. And those are collected through interviews with experts, through database research, it's not a just by chance thing. It's things that people bring to the table because they know about it and they find it intriguing, and there is a first guess of what that could mean in architectural design. So we usually end up with way too much material coming from the group and coming from initial research phases. And what is very important is a functional approach to whatever we are interested in. So here you see a categorization into like basic functions. And those functions could, for example, be color change, it could be shape change, it could be communication. So it could be anything that would represent the function that we were interested in at that specific point in time. And for the design process, we would very often mix those functional categories that also have different meanings for the outcome. So in this case of patterns, we had a range of intangible patterns like rhythms, like swarm architecture, could be a potential translation. But swarming would not really deliver a structure. So we had like a differentiation between primary role models that delivered some kind of structural approach to a potential prototype, and then add on elements that would maybe define color or would maybe allow a reactivity. So we had some, hierarchy between those role models that we used for concept development. And for most of the role models, there was an initial transfer idea. So we had like a very basic idea on how that could inform architectural design, and we tried to grasp that in materials that we developed for the design process. So we had something like play cards with those schemes and with those basic informations. And as I said before, what was very important, and I still think it's very important, to work with analog models as well as simulations. I'm really convinced that our simulations are not good enough yet to capture what is really going on. And what you see here is a nice example of a very, very simple model that helped us to understand how the pufferfish put up his spikes. That was something that we were interested in because of this rapid shape change, and also this surface capacity that changed so radically. And all we could find in the scientific literature was a very bad drawing of a cross-section of the skin. And nobody had worked on, or we didn't come across anything where biologists had really described this in terms of a functional arrangement of layering or materials. So what we did is we interpreted this bad drawing that we found, and it seemed that these spikes were like harder elements that were embedded in a layered system of skins, and the moment that this pufferfish inflates, the geometry changes so much that those spikes are put up automatically without any muscular movement. And we tried that with those very simple analog models of having an inflated balloon and having nylon stockings to simulate those multi-layer skin systems. And as you can see, it works pretty well, even at that naive stage of abstraction. At the same time, we also worked with architectural softwares to create spatial simulations. What you see here is a software that is called Rhino, and that was used to simulate the growth of the banyan tree. This was really difficult, so it's very, very complex what's going on there. And nonetheless, we managed to get some kind of abstraction out of it that has a morphological similarity with what the banyan trees exhibit. More simple models were the growth of the giant clam, for example. That's a simple rim growth, but even for simulating that, you need a good set of rules that captures what's going on. So here, obviously important is the width of those growth rings, the curvature degree, and the translation height. So those parameters are sufficient to mimic that on a computational level. And with mimicking itself, it's not enough. The interesting part starts now. As you have established those rules, you can leave the parameters that are given by biology and start doing other things. So what came out of this was a totally different range of shapes that was based on that set of rules. So the interesting part was to leave those boundary conditions that biology requires to keep that organism surviving, and use that set of rules in another context. And those growth simulations were so intriguing and so interesting for us that we decided to follow up in a follow-up project, and this was called Growing as Building, and we were lucky to get it funded. It was really a large research fund that we got for 2.5 years for a number of people, researching how we could get from this construction stage to something that is more like those living bridges that you probably all have heard of. So Growing as Building takes growth patterns and dynamics from nature and applies them for a new living architecture. So that was the program of this research. And again, a large number of people consisted of the consortium. So you see here a number of experts in different fields, and you also see that there's a number of students part of it. So that's another basic principle of our research projects. We always had student collaborators, and I think in design this is just extremely intriguing, because those people bring in new technologies, they bring in fresh ideas, and what they experience in the project influences their further career very much. So they learn to work more scientifically, they learn other backgrounds, they meet experts in the field that they would not come across easily otherwise. So I think that's really a very fruitful way to have like a research-based teaching. The three topics that we were interested in, or three approaches, were we wanted to study biological growth, we wanted to integrate biology in material systems, and we wanted to tamper with existing architecture. So we wanted to really use what we have and also work with existing buildings. And the project was very, very free from the outset. So our first hurdle was to develop what we actually wanted to do, which might sound funny because usually in projects you have a very narrow outset. But due to this allocation in the space of the arts, the outset was really just given by the investigation of growth principles. And it took us a long time to define what we actually wanted to do in architecture. And it was also very, very interesting to look at that a bit closer. So if we could imagine the architecture of the future, how should it be? What do we wish as architects? And the winner of this contest was the self-designing architecture or self-building architecture. That was very interesting because it was totally unexpected by all of us, but that was ranked really high by all of the people that we have asked. So the self-designing building was definitely top on our wish list. And so again, here we worked with sets of those target definitions that we made and biological role models that we thought could fit to those targets, and tried to define growth-related principles that related those two sides and helped us drive the project. So this was a very basic list of analogies that we started off with. Another important part of the project was that we had a biolab. So in previous projects we experienced the lack of scientific materials. So for this project we decided we could do our own piece of research. We had biologists on board, we had a microbiologist, we had a botanist, we had several people experienced in this field. And so we decided to do our own stuff and establish our biolab at the University of Applied Arts. That was a super nice idea, and it was projected to run for 3 months, and then it took us about 2 years to end this biolab phase. So it extended way more than was expected, and the biolab became not only a research part, but it became also the most important production facility in the project. So over the project duration, the role of this biolab changed fundamentally, and there were several iterations where we tried to redefine what it meant for the project and try to find out what we were actually doing. And we did different threads of experimentation, so I can just show you the most important ones here. And those were, we were experimenting with the organisms of slime mold, and we grew mushrooms. We worked with Mycelium Material. So those were kind of the main threads, and then we also worked with 3D printing. We developed a cable printer. We experimented with root growth. We did all sorts of other stuff that didn't go a lot further, and all of this is published and was also exhibited. And this is just to give you an impression of how we worked. So we had this makeshift biolab where we had really problems to cultivate all those organisms with our limited experience and also with our limited means. So we didn't have a proper temperature and humidity control in those rooms. So some things worked out in some seasons. So growing mycelium in spring and fall was easy. In winter it was challenging. It's it was really it took us a lot of effort to really do this. And for the slime molds, the thing that we actually managed here is to translate something that was described for a two-dimensional setting, like the slime mold being capable of finding food sources in a very, very efficient way. So it's a perfect pathfinder in a way that is still difficult to simulate. And in the project we could show that this is also working in 3D, and nobody had ever tried that before. So what we did is we took a 3D printed model of an architectural space that existed, and it's actually those fortification structures for the world wars in the Thames estuary that we used for that. And so we printed this grid and put food sources there to let the slime mold grow through it, and then made scans and photogrammetric recordings of the growth of the organism and used that to develop an architectural project that you see here. So this was the growth of the slime mold in those 3D models was used to create a new project for reactivation of the so-called Maunsell force that you might probably know. And we also experimented a lot with mycelium material. We were very interested in this material because it's a way to create a lightweight, very cheap construction material that you could use for many purposes out of organic waste material like sawdust, paper, straw. So what you see here is the ingredients for that exercise, and we mix it this fungal spore material that you can buy with this waste material, and then you have to keep it under specific conditions until the mycelium grows through the substrate and solidifies it in this way. So what happens is that those very, very tiny hyphae of this fungal network connects those aggregate of loose pieces of material and creates a lightweight material that could actually be used for building. As a side effect, you get also fruiting bodies if the conditions are favorable, and also the aesthetics of those fruiting bodies was really fascinating. And you see some of them here. And the process as such is a material generation, but it's not creating a specific shape. The shape has to be given by the scaffold that you use for filling in that substrate. And we were experimenting for a while with very solid hard scaffolds like this, and we tried to make like organic structures, and that was a big failure because you can see here that the material, when it dries, shrinks a lot, and so you have really a problem with disconnecting the shapes out of a complex mold. So you really have to design for that shrinkage process as well. And that's what we started as a next step. So we made like molds that could also deliver like modular shapes of like brick-like elements that we could then connect to architectural pieces. And we also experimented with basket shapes. That was less successful. You can see that the compression of the material was really difficult with those shapes. And the most successful examples were paper shapes that you see here. So this is a grid shell made of cardboard that is filled with a substrate. And here the scaffold is totally lost because it's eaten up by the fungus as well. And so the integration of the scaffold into the system is really good. So that's, I would say, the most successful example when you want to go about creating complex shapes with this material system. And as a last point, we also experimented a little bit with textile systems, and that's something that we want to follow up in Akron with a research project that we are just working on. And so, as I said before, we did a lot more in a variety of directions, and we presented everything in a big exhibition that we held in Vienna. And that's one of the advantages of working at a big art school, that they have really great facilities also for exhibitions. So they have a gallery in Vienna in the first district with a, you can see Jugendstil ceiling made of glass. So it was an amazing setting where we could exhibit our project. And we also always try to have good publications, integrate graphic designers for creating books. So those two books were the outcome of those two projects that I showed you, and I think you can still have them on Amazon as far as I know. If you encounter problems, let me know. I can help you getting maybe a PDF file. And there's also websites about the project, so you can dig into more details on biomimetics.com or growingasbuilding.org if you are interested to know all the other experiments that we did in these 2.5 years. And jumping to the University of Akron now, the things that I do there are more focused on basic research, just because I have the opportunity at the Department of Biology to do way more research than I ever anticipated. And this is stuff that was generated by my PhD student Ariana Rupp, who is an engineer and industrial designer from Portugal. And she's at the moment in her 3rd year of PhD work of 5 years. So she has 2 more years to work on this project. And she started being interested in leaves and thermodynamics of leaves. And we developed a biomimetic setup to test evaporation of water in different shapes. So we are interested in the relationship between evaporation and shape. And so she designed a variety of shapes to test different ideas that we had how this works. And there seems to be a really strong connection between design and evaporation that happens. So there seems to be something like a more dissipative shape and a more retaining shape. And these are terms that we have not yet found in literature, and we also didn't find any description of that at all. So we decided to dig into that further, and Ariana searched for examples that she wanted to work on, and she chose those 3 different species she works with. So we work with oak leaves, maple leaves, and elm leaves for different interesting aspects that they perform. And out of those leaf shape investigation, she developed a leaf-inspired shape family. And you can see here that there's a circular setup to, exclude these bilateral symmetry effects. And there's also a rough scale that seems to be similar to the size of leaves. So we still didn't leave the same scale that we find in biology. And you can see that there's 2 different scales. So there's something that is called lobes in botany, which are the larger scale shape changes. And then there's teeth, which are the small scale shape changes of leaves. So that's something that she abstracted into a shape family. And so what we found is that there's some already described geometrical relationships. They're called, for example, leaf dissection index. That's the relationship between perimeter and surface area. That's very clear. And then there's something that's called convexity. For some strange reason, it has nothing to do with convexity at all, but it gives you a relationship between the surface area and the surface area that is kind of circumscribed in the shape of the leaf. So if you see the yellow area in relationship to the actual internal area of the shape, that's the convexity level. And it seems that this leaf dissection index and convexity together give a rough idea of what's going on, if this is a more dissipative or a more retaining shape. And so what she did is she created a parametric design for those shapes in rhino and grasshopper, and then laser cut those shapes with a material that is like, in German I would say Löschpapier, so it's a paper that is used to catch up fluids. So it's a very open fibrous material, similar to paper towel. And we found one producer with a very uniform quality production, so we took on that product and tried also to investigate a bit of the stability of the structure, and it seemed to be sufficient for our research. And so Ariana did evaporation studies with those biomimetic models, and the setup looked like that we tried to get a basin and have it with water filled, and then there's a platform for those models to allow a very uniform wetting situation. And then the whole thing is put on an analytical scale, so we can measure the water loss by loss of mass, and then at the same time we look at the whole thing with a thermal camera and observe the drying process. And that's very interesting, and in spite of us not being able yet to control the environmental conditions, we can only make comparative studies. But what you can see is that actually the more dispersed the geometry is, the faster the objects dry. And you can see that the shape has a very big influence in the drying process. And we would assume that the more we dig into those geometric relationships, the easier it will be to transfer those findings into some kind of application. And the potential application areas that we see are architectural design, but also electronics. So it's everything where you need to dissipate energy by being able to dissipate water. Or wearable technologies would also be an application. And I'm thinking about like sweating facades, using evaporation to cool facade elements. And the other project that we started is research into birds' nests, because that's also a very interesting material structure. So what we have here is a structural design. So we have elements that are not connected by anything, so we don't have any, glues or any, technical ways, and still this structure is capable of taking loads. It's very stable. It's creating a coherent system, and so we are researching especially stick nests, like the ones of the storks, for example, and other birds that exhibit those features. So we took samples of nests and took measurements and used a computer tomography to get about the structure of those nests. And we did a review of the literature. So what we found is also that those nests have some very basic ingredients in common. So those stick nests usually have a base. They have an inner cup and an outer cup consisting of different materialities. And what intrigues me as an architect as well is this close connection to cultural technologies like weaving or basket making. So that's something that also triggers me as something that people have found due to, long centuries and thousands of years of empirical trial and error. And with those principles, we did a summer school at the Bauhaus Bernau last summer. And students from architecture, design, and a variety of backgrounds got hold of this scientific material that we had and did their own projects on this. And what you see here is a totally unexpected project that one of the designers came up with. So she started researching into the colors of birds' nests, which was really weird. So we didn't find anything about that in the scientific literature. Nobody has ever thought about the colors of birds' nests, obviously. And so she found a way to take those photographs and then pixelate them and abstracted a color palette from those nests, and that was really interesting. Another side effect of that was also that we discovered that all of the nests contained artificial technical materials. That was really amazing. So I had asked her before the workshop all the 12 participants to bring nests from their homes. So we had nests from Azerbaijan, from Turkey, from France, from Spain, from Portugal, from Austria and Germany. And all those nests contained artificially produced fibers, all of them. There was not a single one not containing any kind of artificial stuff. So that was really impressive. And with the colors, that came out very clearly as well. So it was really fun to see that. And she also was interested in the transparency of the structures and played around with other materials to mimic that as well. And I was personally interested in the more structural design of birds' nests, and the physics papers that talk about birds' nests physics, they say that it's really interesting that stick nests elements connect with other elements in between 6 and 10 points. So there is obviously some, basic rule to how those nests are constructed. So I got interested in that connectivity aspect, and I tried to make structures that always connect with either 6 points or 10 points. And I tried to make those models with analog ways, and I'm still looking for a computational designer who can program that. So that's one thing I would really love to follow up on. And then other people were interested in, adobe structures. So I had really young students in this group, and that was the first time that they worked with clay. So they were doing this bird hotel. And then again, another group was interested in basket making and weaving, and they came up with a huge model of a basket. And another group came up with this trash nest. And that looks like an art project, but in fact they did materials research before and then applied their findings to the trash, and in this way arranged the elements. So that had a really very strong scientific background as far as you can do within the time frame of 1 week. So I think that was a really successful example of a design workshop that was based on like previous research that we fed into the group. So we are still continuing with the bird's nest project. So we are doing, extending our reviews. We are collecting bird's nests. We're trying to find out how we can actually get more material about stick nests. And the problem is that stick nests are built by larger birds that are difficult to keep. So we are negotiating with different groups of researchers about getting material. And this is a collaboration that I do with my colleague from physics, Dr. Hunter King. So that's something that we both try to pursue. And the structure that you see in the background is one that was done by the group around Achim Menges at the Institute for Computational Design in Stuttgart. So they have worked on those what they call granular architectures for quite a while, and this is I think the outcome of the PhD work of Carola Dierich. So they set this example on what you can actually do with those aggregate structures. Yes, so and last but not least, a few words about the group at the University of Akron. So the Biomimicry Research and Innovation Center was established 7 years ago, and at the core of the center is a PhD program in integrated biosciences. And I also would like to use this chance to advertise for PhD positions at Akron. So we continuously accept applications. It's a very lengthy process for internationals, so there's a GRE and TOEFL test required, but it's a fully funded PhD program, so we collaborate with partners from industry. People usually work 20 hours per week with a corporate sponsor and spend the rest of the time doing their PhD studies, which in good settings totally overlap. In some settings that doesn't work out, and the work at the company diverges a bit from the PhD stuff, but I still think it's a really unique model. And if you're interested, don't hesitate to get in touch with me anytime. And and with this, I would like to thank my collaborators from these various institutions that I've worked with in the past years, where those projects were allocated at, and I want to thank you for your attention.